Good morning, everyone, and welcome to MAX, Michigan-Australia Exchange, where the good idea get exchanged. And we have the second summit in mobility. And my name is Majid Savi. I'm the professor in transport engineering in the University of Melbourne, and I'm going to be your host for today. So without further ado, I would like to invite our Pro-Vice Chancellor, Professor Mark Hargraves, to officially open the summit. Mark is our Pro-Vice Chancellor, Research and Partnership, and he has responsibility for internal collaboration schemes, as well as important relationship between the university and his research partners, and that's why we have Mark here. This is a very important partnership that Michigan and Australia through Melbourne University is having. So I would like to invite Professor Mark Hargraves to come to the stage and open up the summit officially. Mark?
Thanks very much, Majid. On behalf of the University of Melbourne and Vice-Chancellor Duncan Maskell, who unfortunately is unable to be here today, I'd like to welcome you to the University of Melbourne and to Engineers Australia. And on behalf of you all, acknowledge that we meet on the lands of the Wurundjeri people, the traditional owners and custodians of the land on which we meet. And I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. Thanks for joining us. We've put on our best late winter weather for you here in Melbourne. It's like this all the time in Melbourne. And I'd particularly like to welcome our friends and guests from Michigan, in particular Susan Proctor from the Michigan Economic Development Corporation, Dr. Jim Sayer from the University of Michigan, and Paul Krutko from the Ann Arbor Spark. And from closer to home, Rollin Pitar from the Department of Infrastructure, Transport, Cities and Regional Development, Susan Harris and Dean Zabrazak from ITS Australia. At the University of Melbourne, we do education and we do research, and our goal is to do the highest quality research, but to translate that into impact in our communities, local, national and global. And we do that very often in partnership with government and with industry. And so I think it's emblematic of that aspiration, that relationship that we meet here with a professional body, with government partners, with industry partners and with international partners. And so I'm sure today is going to be a very stimulating set of conversations, some exciting emerging technologies. Margin and his team are doing some wonderful work on instrumented, censored urban sites, autonomous vehicles. So well done to Margin and his colleagues in the School of Engineering for hosting today and the work that they do. So on behalf of the University and Vice-Chancellor Maskell, welcome, have a wonderful day, and I look forward, I'll stay here till morning tea, and I look forward to at least hearing part of the conversation. So thank you for your support of the event today, and welcome.
Yes, so Mark, on the stage till the break, please feel free to go, introduce yourself and have some conversation. All right, so some sort of housekeeping. We will have, this event filming. So please, be mindful of that. But we're going to be on the page of Melbourne University, and some people can look at it in terms of a presentation. We also have basically, our lunch served upstairs. So where I think you came in. So that's going to be the lunch. And I'm going to go through the program very quickly. So this is the outline of the program for today. So we're starting the program with a panel discussion, talking about what happened in Michigan when a delegate from Melbourne University, Austrode from federal government, and from ITS Australia went up to discuss collaboration with Michigan. So we're going to have a panel about that chaired by Peter Sweetman. Then we have a coffee break, and hopefully we have the Minister Guy coming and talking to us in terms of portfolio. Then we'll have a lunch break, and we have a panel discussion and some roundtable and so until we get to the 4 o'clock when we have a network drink that is sponsored by WSP. And if you would interested to download the program, there is a link down there. You can go there and download the program. So we decided to not print it and put it on the table. So please feel free to look at it through that link. What else? Nothing in terms of housekeeping. Let's move on to the next person. I would like to introduce Susan Proctor. Susan has more than 20 years of experience with the Michigan Economic Development Corporation, MEDC, including key leadership role in marketing, communication, and international business development. She most recently served as a director of a strategic initiative for the state of Michigan Automotive office. During her tenure, she played a key role in establishing memorandum of understanding, including this one, with the United Kingdom, Australia, and Netherlands, and managed many other international collaborative relationships on behalf of the MEDC. And she was a wonderful host when we visited in Michigan. And thank you very much, Susan, for coming all the way down for this summit. So I would like to basically, ask Susan to say a few words, and then we move to the next.
Wow, it's Friday. It's been a very busy week for most of you, I think, for going to ITS. So we really appreciate you being here today to be part of this conversation. Thank you, Majid, for the really kind introduction. I'm going to make my opening remarks very brief. We've got a great agenda in front of us. I want to first, I think most of my remarks will be thank yous. Thank you to the team at University of Melbourne for hosting us today, doing such an awesome job at putting this together. I believe we're at capacity for this event. Thanks also to Susan Harris, CEO of ITS, for including all of our colleagues in your programming over the last couple days. Thank you so much for getting us as part of that conversation. Since we've arrived, as we've talked to people over the last couple days, there's so many Michigan connections here in Australia. So we're really glad to be here, and we truly feel at home. My colleagues here from Michigan today are Paul Krutko, from the CEO of Ann Arbor Spark, Jim Sayer, the director of the University of Michigan Transportation Research Institute, the other U of M in the other hemisphere, and Sarah Tennant of the Michigan Economic Development Corporation. The MEDC, the organization that Sarah and I represent, serves as the marketing arm of the state. We work in collaboration with more than 100 economic development partners across the state of Michigan, both to market Michigan, both domestically and internationally, as a place to do business and foster the growth of vibrant communities. The automotive industry has been a key engine behind Michigan's economy for over a century. Around the world, Detroit is globally recognized as the Motor City, and Michigan itself is famous for putting the world on wheels. As home to the big three automakers, Michigan has historically led not only the North American industry, but the world in manufacturing the future of transportation. Like Australia, we have a strong automotive R&D base. In fact, 76% of all the automotive R&D investment happens in Michigan. That's about, put it in perspective, about $10 billion a year. And that's 7 times more than any other U.S. state. The automotive industry, as we know it, however, is poised to change dramatically, disrupting the world of mobility as automated electric vehicles become more common and connected intelligent infrastructure replaces offline equipment. We are evolving with an industry that is changing in ways that we never anticipated. New and emerging technologies will forever change the way we move people and goods around. In Michigan, we've leveraged our legacy of innovation, and we've worked proactively to build the infrastructure and regulatory environment to accommodate new technologies. We've also invested in state-of-the-art, purpose-built CAV proving grounds, including M-City and the American Center for Mobility. You'll hear more about those facilities from my colleagues here today. With new technologies offering solutions to critical mobility challenges, we need to collaborate in ways that we never considered before to ensure that we responsibly deploy these technologies into our intelligent transportation systems. At the end of the day, it's about saving lives and providing equitable transportation for those that we serve. Recognizing the critical importance of collaboration, the state of Michigan entered into a memorandum of understanding with the Australian government in 2018. With historically low unemployment, an aging population, and an ever-broadening skills gap, we need to work together globally to tap the enormous possibilities that the new mobility technologies present. Through the MOU with the Australian government, we wish to strengthen bilateral collaboration across our respective mobility, automotive, and technology sectors. We are here today to roll up our sleeves and discuss how we can work together in tangible ways to leverage our many synergies to mutual benefit. To close and to get on with the program, because honestly, there's some great speakers here today, I'd like to express special thanks to the MOU execution team, the core MOU execution team that's represented here today and who you're going to hear from in a minute. Is represented by Peter Sweatman and Majid Sarvi from the University of Melbourne, Rollin Pitar from the Australian Department of Infrastructure, Transport, Cities and Regional Development, John Wall of Austroads, and Susan Harris of ITS Australia. Sincere thanks to you and your teams for your commitment to move our mission of collaboration forward. Once again, thank you all for being here. I hope we come away with some new relationships and valuable learnings, and happy Father's Day.
Thank you, Susan. Really appreciate it. As Susan mentioned, the main partners in this partnership has been the Australian government, ITS Australia, and Austroads, and the University of Melbourne, as well as Michigan Economic Development and Corporation. And we're also very grateful to the federal government for generously supporting this summit. Thank you, Rollin. We appreciate it. So we move to the next, basically officially the first session of this summit is a panel discussion, multimodal thought leadership, the MOU. So in this, Peter Sweatman is going to chair it. Just going to quickly, Peter has a very long CV, very impressive CV. I'm just going to say a few words about Peter. I think he's very well known, doesn't need introduction, but just for those who doesn't know Peter, Peter is a international enterprise professor in transport engineering program at the University of Melbourne, and he's also the co-founding principal of Kavita. He has over 30 years of experience in transportation research and innovation and the application of R&D. He has vast experience, working in academia, basically industry as well as government. He's been working intensively in Europe, Asia Pacific, and United States. And we are very pleased to have him today with us. So without further ado, I would like to ask Peter to take the stage and run the next panel.
I might start off over here. Thank you. Thank you, Majid. Good morning. Good morning. Good morning. As one American sitting over here replied immediately, thank you. It's a great tradition, I think. In Texas, they say, howdy. No, okay, well, you don't understand. So it's a pleasure to be here. What a cool place. Very cool for engineers, I think, We're coming up in the world, I think. This is great. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about, Majid sort of read some stuff out there, but I'm thrilled to be working with the University of Melbourne. And that was my alma mater. That's where I did my PhD in vehicle dynamics a long time ago. And so I'm thrilled to have some activities there, as well as Kavita, of course, which is a US-based consulting company in CAV. It's right there in the name. And Abbas Malhadis and I started that company. It was acquired by Econolite, and Kirk Steidl, and this is all just by way of full disclosure, Kirk Steidl, who was with us the last couple of days, is a senior vice president of Econolite and also is part of Kavita as well. as is Barry Einzig, who was with Cisco and I think is known to all of you. So that's what I spend most of my time on, but I'm getting very excited about what's happening here with AIMS, and I'd like to spend more time here and really get involved in that. So I just want to make that clear, because when I talk to people, everyone's got a completely different impression about where I live and what I do. So I had 12 years in Michigan, in Ann Arbor, heading up Tree. The current director is with us today, I'm pleased to say, Jim Sayer. And then 3 years in California. So 3 years isn't really long enough to become a fully fledged Californian, or even Southern Californian, because those of you who've lived there know that there's sort of a bit of a divide there, to say the least. So certainly enjoying living there and so on, but part of my heart is in Michigan. So we've got a great group here, and these are the core folks who've been putting this MOU together. We got a bit sick of calling it the MOU, so Les Baxter kindly came up with a great name for it, MAX. So we hope you agree that's a good name. So we're ripe for collaboration. So I don't need to tell you, we've been here talking about this the last couple of days, the global era of digital mobility. The MOU was signed almost exactly a year ago. So we've been working hard to put some meat on the bones of that agreement. Michigan, I don't need to say too much. I don't think we've heard quite a bit the last couple of days, but obviously large field operational tests, model deployments and so on have been the order of the day. And the word I always think of when I think of America is rigor. So this is rigorous stuff where data is collected, data is analysed, and decisions get made based on that data. So these are not demonstrations. This is rigorous research. And in the mode of the automotive industry, we can learn a lot there about learning cycles in developing a successful product. So the only way, and even more so than with an automobile, now we're dealing with a system of users who are all completely different. So as we get to automation, we need to have these rapid learning cycles. So start small and build and build. That's the model that's been followed in Michigan. So I think we can learn a lot from that. And I think we've got a great start here with AIMS, but also the other test beds that are being developed. The Australian Societal View there, I love that report that Infrastructure Victoria put out a year or so ago. It's had a really good reception in the US. A lot of people talk about it. National academies discuss it. So don't underestimate how good that was. And it basically concluded that 97% of Victorians would be better off with widely deployed CAV, the biggest thing since the car, and that the investments required in the road network and IT would be modest. There'd be investments, but they'd be modest. So it made a very good case. So I wanted to mention that. And of course the test beds, AIMS, CAVI, CITS, and Australia, I think, is noted around the world for the safe systems approach as well. And I think that works in very well, especially with connected vehicles. So this is my last slide here, just to say test beds, model deployments, safety evaluation are all critically important, and you need to have all of those things bundled together as much as you can. So in Michigan, automated driving systems, ADSs, and auto manufacturing at scale. So back 10 years ago in Michigan, there was great concern about Silicon Valley coming along about to eat our lunch on the automotive front. That hasn't happened. In fact, the pendulum has swung back the other way, because it's very important, that second piece there, and auto manufacturing at scale. And as part of that, the safety know-how and the safety culture that those automakers have is nobody can match that. Nobody knows more about automotive safety than those companies. So you've got to have that. Test scenarios have been developed at M-City, the fake city that we put together, and now on a bigger scale at the American Centre for Mobility, and Paul Krutko's here to talk about that. Planet M, you just met Susan Proctor, and it's amazing, and her colleague Sarah Tennant is here, and it's amazing how much is going on in southeastern Michigan. So we're very proud of Ames, we're proud of the other test beds that are underway here, and let's remember that automated is kind of interesting and sexy, but connected is far more interesting when you stop and think about it. And I'm sick of everyone just looking at the surface of what's going on here, and we tend to become an echo chamber, but we need to think 3, 5, 10 questions deep about connected technology and what that can do for us, because that's going to make a huge difference to safety in its own right. So we have this vehicle for collaboration. We had a conference here, as I said, last October to kick it off, and here we are again, which is great. And we had a group went to Michigan in January just to prove this wasn't a boondoggle. We went to January, and I could tell you some stories about how some of the Australian delegates looked when we had to walk a mile at night to the restaurant in the open air. So, we've been through a lot to get where we are today. So, I want to bring up. I didn't really intend to do a presentation, but I want to invite the panel to come up. Rollin Pitar from the Department of Transport and Infrastructure, John Wall from Austroads, Susan Harris, ITS Australia. Please come and sit on these little devices over here. Susan Proctor from MEDC, and Majid Savi himself. And so some of these folks have a short presentation. To some extent, this is a rerun of our team effort presenting this idea in Detroit in January at the Automobility conference, which was great. But there are some slight variations. Now, I think, Nick, we're going to start with one of the Susans. Is that correct? Yeah. Susan Proctor.
Oh, okay.
Sorry, that's what I'm told.
Right. Can you hear me? Awesome. Okay, I think I have some slides, right?
Yeah, I think you've got them.
All right, wonderful. Okay, right here, or I can do this too, right? All right. There we are, pure opportunity in Michigan. I usually start by sort of giving everybody a sort of a geographic idea of where we are on the North American continent. There we are in Michigan at the northern part of the Great Lakes. Just a few fun facts about Michigan. 20% of the world's fresh water surrounds our state, so it literally defines who we are. Oops, I best do this here if I'm going to wander around. And also, we're located within 800 kilometers of half the U.S. and Canadian population, so it puts us on a very strategic place in the USMC trade corridor, and we border Canada to the north. So I always like to start with a little bit of geographic location to get us sort of oriented. Peter asked me to talk a little bit about what it is that the MEDC does. And as you can see, we focus mostly on image based on place. And of course, transportation and transportation opportunities and mobility is central to that conversation as we talk about not only attracting businesses, but attracting talent and making our communities great places to live. In Michigan, economic development is definitely a team sport. Represented today, we have at least the University of Michigan. We have a number of other universities that will open their doors when companies come in to check Michigan out. Our job is to ensure that you get connected, and we connect anybody that's interested in getting involved in Michigan's ecosystem. Oops. So we have sort of three core foci, and one of them is to develop business. And so we do that through commercialization, connecting our entrepreneurs with our university base, growing the companies that we already have. There's one other professional economic developer in the room, Paul Krutko, and he and I will agree that about 80% of the business growth in any community is due to retention and growth of the businesses that you already have. So we focus a lot on that. And then, of course, we focus on attracting FDI as defined by both domestic and international investment. More and more, we're moving towards an entrepreneurial focus. We want to ensure that all of these new technologies that we're injecting into our intelligent transportation systems land in Michigan. As Peter said a little while ago, I was confronted all the time with people from Silicon Valley that said, indeed, yeah, you guys are going by the wayside, right? You're gonna lose to Silicon Valley. Well, I think not. We still make stuff really well in Michigan, and not only do you need the stuff that the technology, but you need the hardware that it goes into. So we're still really good at that. What's cool though is we've really focused on mobility startups, right? And Planet M was a brand, strictly only a brand that we launched about a year ago. And what it was meant to do is collect all of Michigan's collective mobility assets under a collective brand, Planet M for Michigan, M for mobility. What we realized is there was a lot of, and actually any Michigan company is really considered part of that Planet M ecosystem. But it really needed some legs, right? And so we realized that there was so much interest in getting injected into Michigan's mobility ecosystem that we had to go a little bit further. And so we launched Planet M as more of a business development platform. And it's really kind of a concierge service, right? So any business that's interested in getting into Michigan's mobility ecosystem can come to us, and we have a landing zone right in the middle of Detroit that businesses can, for a very low cost, land in that spot. We have a lot of not only startups as part of that partnership. I think there's something like 33 startups, but 16 corporates have signed on to that. And they actually intermingle within that space. So Bosch and Ford are two of those corporate members, and they sort of go in and out of that space. It's a very collaborative working space, and it's very ripe for collaboration. It's really cool. And Sarah and I go work there every once in a while because they have beer taps on the floors, so it's like super cool. So after 5, of course, depending on which time zone, so yeah, and so and then we moved towards. We realized that we really needed to inject companies and get them really into the system by offering them the opportunity to test and activate and validate their technologies on our testing, not only our proving grounds, but our public roadways, because we have some of the best regulatory environment for doing that, better than any other state, and we were really the first to do it. And I have to acknowledge Kurt Steidl, our former MDOT director, who many of you know, for being that rock star that was proactive in making that happen. So we actually give grants for folks to test out their technologies on Michigan roads and on our proving grounds. So I just wanted to kind of give you a timeline of how proactive Michigan has been since 2007, and you all can kind of read this, but we work very, very closely with our Department of Transportation and our public institutions to ensure that we've had the right infrastructure assets and the legislation to support them. So you can see since 2007, the amount of activity that has gone on up until now in 2018, when we were able to provide grants for companies to interact in Michigan. The reason why I bring up this slide is Center for Automotive Research, you see at the bottom. We make data-driven decisions, and we utilize great resources that are in our own backyard, like the Center for Automotive Research. And twofold, the reason why I put the slide up here, we recently did a study with CAR called Future Cities, Navigating the New Era of Mobility. And the reason we did this is we realized that communities and our constituencies often, don't have the definitions of what it is that we're talking about in the communities, right? When you go, talk to your communities about what MOS is, or what microtransit is, or ride sharing or ride hailing, and what that is, what they need to be thinking about for the future, for example, because they're doing their day jobs and they're worried about getting enough parking in their downtown, when maybe they should be thinking about connected technologies that maybe can reduce congestion and reduce that need for parking. So it's a really kind of, while it's not prescriptive, it gives a good primer for what you can tell your constituencies, and it'll help educate them. And that's available on CAR's website. It's open to everybody. We wanted to do that for a reason. So I wanted to mention that really quickly. Look at these people. What a bunch of good-looking people we have here, most of them on the panel. This was us at the North American International Auto Show. There was a panel, great panel, right at the automobility space, which is really cool. The International Auto Show is attended by thousands of people every year. I'm very glad to say that this year, last year, as Peter said, it was in January. This year, we've changed it to June. Yay! So in June, Michigan's weather is absolutely fantastic, but also what that opens up is an entire opportunity to see a lot of the demos in action. We've actually put a couple challenges in place to manage transportation around that show. So I think we just closed the RFP for one opportunity for a grant to figure out how to get people from our airport, Detroit, DTW, to downtown Detroit. And then there's also some opportunities to think about transportation within Detroit with all the influx of individuals that are coming into the city. So, and that's M-City, that's the fake city right there. It looks pretty real though, doesn't it? And they're with Wei Peng, the director there, Jim Sayer's colleague. And that's me, but I do want to also, oh shoot, my last slide is not there. Bummer. I had a great slide of me and Majid and Sarah on scooters. You just have to visualize that. You'll have to visualize it. Great, thank you so much, I appreciate it.
Yeah, it is. Okay. Thank you, Susan. Wonderful.
Sure.
So the idea here is we're really taking a little bit of time to introduce the partners who put this together before we talk about the substance and get your ideas about what we could do and what more we could do. Susan Harris from ITS Australia, another important partner.
Thank you, Peter. I'll just jump over here. Yeah, that's all working. Beautiful. So firstly, thank you very much, Susan, for hosting us in January. It was a real privilege to be a part of the Australian delegation visiting Michigan. It was a super eye-opener from my point of view. You know, Michigan has always been seen as a leader in auto development, but to really see firsthand how the industry has adapted and responded to the new challenges that we see in mobility at the moment. So that the extent of investment and the extent of activity in Michigan was really, really inspirational. And then also reflecting on the extent to which the state is partnering with industry to stimulate this development and ensure that Michigan remains at the centre of activity was another great learning, and I think a great, something that we can reflect on over here perhaps. So this morning I pretty much feel like I'm speaking to the converted. So I'm going to give a quick run through about, just a quick snapshot on the industry here in Australia, but then also talk about some of the activities that we're working on in ITS Australia that I think create a foundation for potential partnerships with Michigan and others internationally. So ITS Australia, we're the peak body for advanced transport technology in Australia. So we're really proud to bring together the leaders in government, industry and academia to collaborate and work together to look at the future of mobility. We operate at that for big companies that are homegrown companies, big international companies operating in Australia, but then also small startups and our government partners. So I think we provide a good foundation to start to look at some of these international collaboration opportunities and bringing together great academic partners such as the University of Melbourne as well. So in terms of Australian ITS, we all know Australia, we're a long way from the rest of the world. We've got huge distances to cover, but we've also got large, rapidly growing cities. So they create unique challenges that inspire the industry here to be really innovative and clever about how we respond to these approaches. So being a long way from the rest of the world, I think it's easy to look inwardly and think we can always do better. But we do, in fact, have some leading ITS technologies that are really well respected, and we're really innovative and clever about the way we apply those. So I know we've got great industry leaders working on leveraging advanced analytics to smooth traffic flow and help manage our cities better. We've got organisations like Cubic in the room that are actively working on that in Sydney at the moment. We've got organisations leveraging connectivity, in particular organisations like Capture. I understand we're celebrating 20 years today since the launch of the first free-flow CityLink. CityLink is the first free-flow multi-lane freeway in the world. So we continue to be leaders in that tolling, that free-flow tolling technology, and that is sort of one of the first examples of connectivity, enabling mobility to continue to move smoothly and enhancing the way that works. We've got world-leading regulation that's supporting provides a framework to support the deployment of autonomous vehicles and highly automated vehicles. And we've got a real mix of both multinationals coming into Australia to leverage the appetite for new technology, as well as homegrown startups that are now starting to launch globally and are playing an active role in the global ecosystem. So I think we're really well placed to form some great partnerships with the teams in Michigan and really look to leverage and learn from each other's expertise. In terms of the things that we're working on in ITS Australia, so we try to pick particular thorny problems that we can work on collaboratively as an industry and help leverage some of these international connections to continue to move the conversation and move the bar higher within the industry. So just over a year ago, we completed a study on mobility as a service in Australia, and we identified that there certainly was a strong appetite and an interest in adapting new mobility solutions. We look particularly at different demographics and different sectors and different geographies that might be well placed to deploy this technology. And that work really provided a great vehicle to then put together an industry reference group. So we now have a national industry reference group with 30 to 40 members, key leaders from government and industry looking to collaborate together to look at the pathway for launching mobility as a service in Australia. So we're not talking about one-size-fits-all solution, but creating the right environment which we can deploy a range of MaaS solutions that are right fit for the local areas. And we've created a vision for MaaS that in particular focuses on key themes that I think help to steer us all as we decide what's the right role for government, what's the right role for industry, and where do we want to be, and keeps us all heading on the right track. So from a MaaS perspective, we came to the conclusions that we wanted something that was obviously efficient and effective. We wanted a vibrant and competitive market, so we don't want one big provider providing and overseeing all of our transport solutions, but something that can enable companies to come and go, and something that's competitive. We want to leverage the existing public transport backbone. That will remain critical, that we have that underlying mass transport service, something that's equitable, and also something that's respectful of privacy and security concerns. So we've also been working with this reference group to leverage some insights from international guests that have highlighted, again, reflecting on the real opportunities that they see for deployments in Australia. And we continue to focus on a number of key areas, so this is quite an active working group within the umbrella of ITS Australia. Another activity that we've been focusing on more recently this year is looking at the projections and the modelling projections for emerging technologies in transport. So what's the impact of automated and connected vehicles going to be on our transport networks? We've seen a lot of interest from governments in trying to predict the impact on our road networks. Peter touched on some of those earlier. They haven't all been, as you would expect, they've all got slightly different views on what the future might be. The future isn't certain, so we've got different views. But it's been identified that ITS Australia, working with AITPM, have a role to play in helping to improve the way we model and project the future. And we've identified a number of focus areas. But I think, so some of them we can look at what we know today and we can look to improve on that. But I think there's also remains to be some questions around the way these technologies get deployed and some new research questions. You know, what's the headway going to be on these vehicles? How are we actually going to, what's the practicalities of how they're going to be deployed and implemented? What sort of take-up are we going to get? Are people going to be sharing vehicles, or are people going to be in vehicles on their own? So these are real questions that have real impacts for our transport networks going forward. And we're not alone in Australia in trying to grapple with these particular questions. Most recently, we're undertaking a new project through the IMove CRC, which we've found to be a really great vehicle for collaborating with government and industry partners and with wide groups of partners from the Australian sector. So this is building on from the work that we've done on mobility as a service, really looking at those challenges of how do we unlock some aspects of that, and in particular, looking at the challenges of parking. So this project is particularly looking at, you know, can we have free flow parking to support new ways of moving through our cities and try and free up these vehicles and not have them stuck parking in our city streets all the time. So lastly, a quick plug. We're certainly looking forward to reconnecting in Singapore with our colleagues from Michigan, and I know many in the room are heading to Singapore. But then May next year, you're all invited to come back to the Asia Pacific Forum. So after the World Congress, this is the next major international event in the ITS calendar. And we hope to see you all up in Singapore, all in Singapore in a couple of months, and then at the Asia Pac Forum in May next year. For those of you who don't know, we've got call for papers out at the moment. That closes at the end of next week. So you've got a week to think about that. And happy to stay connected and any more queries. So thank you very much, Peter. That was a quick run through, but I think we've spent a few days talking about this.
Excellent. So we're going to hear from each of our partners. Thank you, please join me. Our next partner with a presentation is Rollin Pitar from the Department of Infrastructure and Transport, Cities and Regional Development.
Thank you, Peter. Good morning, everyone, and thank you very much for coming along this morning. And if I could again thank the University of Melbourne for hosting, and Professor Mark Hargraves for his opening comments. Thank you also to our guests from Michigan for making the time and the effort to come to the event today, and of course the ITS Australia event over the last couple of days. My name is Rollin Pitar. I am the General Manager in the Office of Future Transport Technology in the Department of Infrastructure, Transport, Cities and Regional Development. I wanted really just to make a few initial framing comments more than anything else, and go back and just touch on where the MOU came from and what the objectives of not just the Australian government, but Australian governments more generally are sorry, I'll drive the technology. That's a bit of a telling point, isn't it? I've got too many devices in my hand. And what the objective of Australian governments more generally is in playing in this space, and what the policy objectives are. I don't want to be too policy wonkish, but I think it's important to understand, or for me to outline some of those purposes. The MOU itself grew out of a trip that one of our former ministers, the Honourable Paul Fletcher, made to the US in June last year, where he met up with the then Governor of Michigan. He had the opportunity of meeting with Kirk Steidl, who Peter has mentioned, and I think Peter himself, and the idea of an MOU with Australia was spawned very quickly, having the experience of MOUs that Michigan had then with the UK and Netherlands, I think, at the time as well. So we had already some relationships, of course, going on with Michigan, but we thought putting together a framework which accelerated that, which provided mechanisms to bring named parties together, not in an exclusive way, but in an inclusive way, was a good way to go and sort of see what happened. We didn't know exactly what endpoints might look like. We still don't know exactly what endpoints might look like, but to actually see all the people in the room today, I think, is testament to the interest that people have around collaborating in this space. So just a little perspective. Many of you in the room would be aware of these sorts of points that this slide touches on. What I found interesting in our conversations with Michigan is that while Susan gave us a perspective of where the state of Michigan sat in relation to the US, there are actually some really common elements between Michigan and Australia. There are some really highly urbanised parts of Michigan, as Susan outlined. There are actually some really quite remote parts, quite unpopulated parts of Michigan as well. I think Jim was saying last night that his office, which is only his home, which is only 3 or 4 miles from his office, only just has cellular coverage and is on a dirt road. There are areas to the north of the state which are very remote from capitals. So that diversity of population, land use and so on presents some of the similar sorts of challenges that many parts of Australia might have. So there are some real commonalities. The other point I wanted to make is really around what are some of the principles for government action. We're all interested in the technology, and the technology itself is fascinating, whether that's around cooperative intelligent transport systems, whether that's around automated vehicles, whether it's around the technology that makes freeways work more efficiently, traffic signals work in a more harmonised fashion. But what's the real end game? And the real end game is how those technologies make society work better. And those are the outcomes that society is interested in. Those are the outcomes that our politicians and ministers are interested in. And we'll hear some of that, I think, from Assistant Minister G when he's here a little later in the morning. Some of this is encapsulated in a national policy framework for land transport technology that all Australian governments signed up to about 3 years ago. And that articulates a principles-based approach to land transport technology. And essentially, the points that framework makes is that, the transport technology needs to achieve outcomes for society around safety, around accessibility, around efficiency and productivity. And if we break that down, that goes to things like achieving improved congestion outcomes, improving livability of cities. So how can the technology help contribute to those sorts of outcomes? It also outlines some key principles for government action. And really, again, government has a role in establishing frameworks, in establishing mechanisms that help achieve and facilitate and encourage those sorts of outcomes. We've heard about how research, how collaboration can achieve some of those sorts of things. But I think one or two of the key principles that document outlines are really germane to this discussion. And again, government decision-making on transport technologies should be based on the capacity to improve safety, efficiency, sustainability and accessibility outcomes. And accessibility could mean people getting on and off the vehicles themselves for the sake of argument, but it also means access and equity to people maybe in outer metropolitan areas, people in rural and regional areas, that sort of thing. Another one that I think is very germane is that the technology should be implemented in a way that is consumer-centric, designed to meet the needs of those using the service. This includes consideration of options to deliver transport information and services in a way that is consistent and familiar. the diverse needs of travellers, in particular travellers with a disability, vulnerable road users such as cyclists, pedestrians and users of multiple modes of transport. Now, some of this was written 3 years ago, but it's still very pertinent to the sorts of conversations we're having today and have had over the last couple of days. There are a number of other principles that go to things like, governments shouldn't be picking winners, my paraphrase, but that sort of thing, setting the right frameworks for investment and letting business invest in a way that allows appropriate competition in order to then achieve outcomes that deliver against those sort of broad societal outcomes. So, look, I just wanted to mention and touch on a couple of those key framing points, and I think the conversations that we'll have in the room today, the sorts of conversations that have been had over the last couple of days, all feed into a joined up, collaborative approach that really brings together industry, the R&D community and governments to strive to improve those societal outcomes by technology-enabled approaches to meet those objectives. So essentially, they were the main points I wanted to raise. The policy framework that I mentioned has an action plan associated with it. The 3-year action plan essentially wraps up this year. Earlier this month, all transport and infrastructure ministers agreed on a new action plan for the next 3 years. So, if you like, this is a sample of 4 of the actions that governments around the country, I beg your pardon, will want to focus on over the next few years. The safe and legal operation of connected and automated vehicles, a significant body of work that the National Transport Commission is leading on behalf of state, territory and Commonwealth governments. And I'm pretty sure Marcus Burke's in the room here today. Yep, I saw a hand. There you are. Hi, Marcus. So if you want to talk more about that, collar Marcus. Looking at infrastructure requirements for connected and automated vehicles. Data has been a big deal, and deployment models and costs and benefits of CITS vehicle technologies are just a sample of some of the things we want to talk more about. And we've talked with Susan around engaging with ITS Australia. We'll be talking with other industry associations over coming months around some of the implementation plans that we want to develop to actually operationalise some of these points. So, again, we see the MOU as a key element between the Government of Australia and Michigan to, again, focus on collaboration and progress common challenges and opportunities. And I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rollin. So, as we've got a couple more of our team members are going to make some remarks, and then without visual aids, and then we're going to have a little bit of a Q&A, and certainly it might be worth thinking about. Many of you have been at the ITS Australia Summit the last couple of days, so what did we learn there? That, we had some great conversations there, so there's some things that we should be bringing into this conversation, so that could be a starting point for our little discussion that we're going to have. But John Wall from Austroads.
Thanks, Peter.
Thank you.
I don't have a PowerPoint presentation. Don't trust the technology. I do, but I've got a different way, I think, in terms of what I'd like to say today. So my name's John Wall. I'm the Program Manager for Future Vehicles and Technology at Austroads. This is a new program. Is that better?
Yeah.
The program is a new program for Austroads. It's about 3 weeks old, but is built on the wonderful legacy of the Connected and Automated Vehicles program that has been running in some form or another with Austroads since about 2011. For those of you who don't know of Austroads, Austroads is the peak organisation or the peak body for the road agencies across Australia and New Zealand. So we're a private company, but we're owned by the 11 organisations, including the Commonwealth and local government, across both countries of Australia and New Zealand. Together, our members look after about 900,000 kilometres of road network, and for our colleagues from the other side of the world, that's around 560,000 miles of network. It's worth around about $250 billion, and it's really the largest community asset under management that we see across both countries currently. In terms of, I guess, some of the key themes that we're looking at in Austroads, one of the joys I had in coming into the organisation was to conduct a review of the program. And as part of that, there were 5 key themes that were coming out in terms of this connected and automated future that we're working towards. They were around connected and automated vehicles, not surprising, low and zero emission vehicles, so looking at things like electric powertrains and alternative fuel sources, physical infrastructure, digital infrastructure, and the capability and I guess the type of people that as road agencies we're going to need to deploy in the future to actually manage these future networks, the vehicles and the networks. And that, I think, is quite a change. We heard a lot during the conference about the value of data scientists, for instance, and we wonder how many data scientists we've actually got working in road agencies today. Especially if we look, for example, at local government, which actually manages the majority of the road network, both here in Australia and New Zealand, I would expect that we've got very few data scientists actually employed in local government today. But it's certainly going to be a great need for the future. I was very honoured and grateful to be given the opportunity to travel to Detroit earlier in the year to visit Detroit, Ann Arbor, the International Motor Show. What a wonderful experience. But my experience with Detroit goes right back to 2013 when the then director of Umtree was invited to come and visit us in the little town of Wollongong, about 90 kilometres south of Sydney, to talk about a crazy idea we had in Transport for New South Wales, which was to build Australia's first connected vehicle project, and that's a city project, which after all of these years is still operating. It's focused around heavy vehicles and port movements, but we really have a lot to thank Peter in his role as Director of Umtree at the time for coming down and talking to us about the experience that they had with their safety pilot program, which I think Jim is still running in Ann Arbor, and or moved on, but still as part of that. But the wonderful assistance that we had from Umtree in actually helping us in very practical ways to actually deliver that pilot. Everything from installation manuals to ideas around how we could connect with our infrastructure. And that is still going today. That particular project has more than 7 billion connected vehicle records that have been collected over that time. We've also moved into light vehicles as well. So collaboration with Michigan, from my point of view, has been happening for a long time before we actually had the formal MOU in place. But it's great to be part of that formal MOU that we have today. Connectivity is one thing, but collaboration is another. Today is not just about being connected, because I think we are connected. We are connected with Michigan, and we are connected with a lot of the people in this room doing a whole range of activities and work in this area. Today's about bringing it from connectivity to collaboration and cooperativeness. Thank you.
So much, John. And just before, Majid, just before you start, I wanted to ask John a question. I don't think we should let this go through unnoticed. So here is Austroads talking about vehicles and data platforms. So how much of a change and how rapid of a change is that? Seems to be pretty significant.
I can use that one. Thanks, Peter. I think it is going to be a... Peter and I are close but being attached. I think that's the big change that I'm seeing. And to be honest, we've struggled in my previous agency to make sense of the 7 billion records we've got. What a surprise. We just don't have the skill sets. And the biggest thing for us, especially for the government agencies, are attracting those people like data scientists that we traditionally haven't had as employees within our areas, and some areas are a little bit different, especially network operations and things, but to attract them and then to actually keep them. Because, believe it or not, the public service doesn't pay top dollar. And that's one of the things that we've got, but there's so much to learn, but we really need that new skill set in what we're doing, because people talk, and I made a comment last night at dinner, that people talk about data being the new oil, and we've heard all about that, but I keep talking about the need for us to build the refinery, because oils ain't oils, they just sort of... that's for the older people in the audience. What happens is that we've got all of that data and people think, yes, let's get it. But there's a cost to getting it, to storing it, cleaning it and making sense of it. And as transport agencies, we have to start to build refineries. But maybe we don't have to start from scratch. Maybe we can look to the car city of the world and understand how they started in that process, because I know in talking to Jim that Tree's been doing a lot of work in that particular space, and certainly some of the areas out of Ann Arbor, Spark and those areas as well, in terms of the work that they're doing in data, because I think data can really help us solve a lot of the problems that we're seeing today, or at least provide that extra little bit of information that will lead us on to develop solutions.
Thank you, John. Things have changed. I think we kind of knew that. But anyway, we're going to reflect a little bit on what we learned the last couple of days. But our final remarks on the panel, a very important team member, the founder of the AIMS testbed, really doing a great job at the University of Melbourne to galvanise faculty and assets around this important area for the future. Majid Savi.
Thank you, Peter, for a very generous introduction. I just want to be very quick so we can get more time for a panel. Basically, when I visited Michigan, I go to US quite often as part of Transport Research Board activity that is very important conference for all people working in transportation. But what has struck me when I went to Michigan, basically in terms of transportation, the technology and everything was very impressive, but nothing that I didn't expect. But what has struck me really as important thing was that Michigan want to be the first, they want to be leading the world, as Susan mentioned, and that sort of mentality that we need to keep working hard. We need to make sure that everybody want to develop technology and mobility and not just car. Come to Michigan. And I think that was a lesson that I'd like to take back home, because in Australia we have fantastic university, we have fantastic industry and government, and if we work together hard, we could basically do pretty much the same thing. So being a fast follower or being a second best is not an option, at least not for for Melbourne University. We want to be the best. And that's what we drive us. For example, we have fantastic project happening in Queensland. Miranda is here today to talk about it. John talked about the project happening in New South Wales, world-leading project. So we have really good possibility here. I also would like to acknowledge Amanda, the chief scientist here from Victoria. Thank you very much for coming. And I know you're doing a great job by putting university together to be working hard on this rolling stock project that we're going to basically purchase over $100 billion of train and trams in the next 20, 30 years. And the whole idea is how we could generate capability in terms of R&D, in terms of university research around it. So it's a fantastic sort of initiative that we are looking forward to hopefully see it across the transport sector. One of my very good colleague, Gary Liddell, I learned a lot from him. We always talk about we're building lots of infrastructure in Australia. Just in Victoria, over $50 billion, $60 billion. Is it possibility to use this construction that is totally needed as a sort of as a way forward for creating also capability in R&D? So we very much look forward to learning from Michigan. And basically, I think we have the right ingredients in Australia, but we just need to take it a little bit forward and make sure that we do our best to be at the top of the world in terms of developing R&D and facility here. So I wanted to say a few words around my visit to Michigan and what basically was very interesting for me, and I'd like to pass it to Peter to hopefully get some questions from the audience. Thank you.
Yeah, so it's probably not about it. Let's open it up a little bit, and if you have any comments about what you've learned the last couple of days, things that we ought to give some prominence to in our discussion, bearing in mind that by the end of the day we want to get a lot of input from you. And tomorrow morning in good US style, we're going to have a breakfast meeting on a Saturday. This group, I think they're all committed. I think they are. And we're going to sort of decide what our program is going to be for the next year or two. So today is a great opportunity to hear from you and to clarify our own thoughts about this. So is anyone? Yes, please.
Yeah, hi.
Please identify yourself as you.
I'm happy to do that. I'm Errol Kruger. I'm an entrepreneur. It's been a fantastic week, and I think the convergence in this room, the convergence on the panel, we've got academics, engineers, economists, we've got government, brilliant. I'm going to put a counter to that, and I consult to owners of software companies. They get to a certain size and frankly they lose their way. It's no coincidence that software and automation are crashing together, and what I'm interested in is exporting our entrepreneurship to Michigan. Okay, I've got an idea for you later, Susan. But the observation, just if we think at an abstract level, we're really looking at a new form of enterprise. And I think we're going to challenge all of the Keynes and all those guys back in the past. And what we're actually seeing here is basically it's the end of industry verticals, right? That we're seeding that. We've had some really brilliant entrepreneurs, fuse different businesses together. We know who they are, but now we're actually we're architecting the end of the vertical era in economics. So I'm really pleased to be part of that. Majid, don't yawn. We're going to need some academic credentialing along our journey. Okay? Thank you.
Thank you, Errol. Thank you. Would one of the panellists like to respond to that?
Well,
It's a wacky thought, I know.
a wacky thought. Yeah, well, we would love to welcome you to Michigan, quite frankly. And, to your point, we've all had to begin to think differently about this. And in Michigan, we're seeing a lot of partnerships between the OEs and technology companies that we've never seen before. There's a lot of acquisition going on. And so I think across the board, we're seeing this really dynamic thing happening in those silos kind of breaking down, where they're really looking at solutions, technology solutions, the OEs are, that they would have never considered looking outside before. So I just want to, verify your comments there, and we would welcome you to come to Michigan. Let's talk further.
Thanks, Susan. I think, Errol, we do recognise the ecosystem aspect of this. So it's not necessarily that it's going to be fused together in an industrial sense, but we're still going to have separate sectors, but the ecosystem aspect is very powerful and takes a long time to figure out. And that's one of the things I think in Michigan that we've worked at, and certainly the OEMs have been in the centre of this, and Silicon Valley coming at it from a completely different angle. But many other sectors needed, telecommunications, insurance, you name it. And that's certainly been part of what's been done in Michigan, and I think it's happening here too through IMove and through ITS Australia. And so we recognise that. Our experience was that automakers are very used to sitting in a room with their competitors and feel comfortable. Some of the newest sectors to this, such as telecoms and so on, IT companies, not so comfortable because they're learning something new as a group, and they don't want their competitors to be in that room. So there's some interesting subtleties that we learned in Michigan as we went along. I think, Susan, you had a comment.
I disagree that we're seeing this real mash-up of different industries coming together, and it's a real opportunity. Change creates opportunity, and never before have I seen that partnerships have been so important. So from our members, it's those that are taking the risks and those are out partnering in new ways that are really seeing the results of that success.
Can I add? Sorry, John. Just 2 points. One is that OEMs are not innovating fast enough, right? And I think, it's present companies, maybe, but that's the vibe. The other thing is in IT ecosystems have not fulfilled. They've been too costly. They haven't delivered the transformation. And so I think we need to change our thinking about the economy. We operate in the economic context to get people to extend their effort. It's a roll up your sleeves. Sorry.
Well, no, it's a good point. And I think we need to recognise from the OEM perspective, they talk about AV 1.0 and AV 2.0. AV 1.0 is business as usual to the extent that they want to exploit, they use the word exploit, this technology, these automated technologies in their new product lines as they're going forward. They've got to keep that pipeline full, and they've got to be innovating even faster than they have in the past. And then AV 2.0 is completely different. That's mobility as a service. Completely different business model for them. So they're trying to create something for 10 years out, 5 or 10 years out, when they think that's going to become a much bigger demand than it is now. But they still have to keep doing what they're doing, and they are implementing these technologies in an incremental way as fast as they can. Anybody else? Oh, please.
Amanda Caples, Victorian Government. I really like the metaphor of refineries in relation to the skills that we need around data, so I might use that, so thank you for that.
I've got a patent on that, but we'll talk later.
I was talking to someone from Transport for London about a year or so ago. We were talking about data skills, about this very issue, and they talked about having a graduate program and the pros and cons of that, and how they'd trialled a program taking school leavers and actually almost like an apprenticeship for school leavers rather than necessarily graduates. So, and probably the answer is we need both types of programs, but I was just interested in the panel's views around initiatives that have been undertaken to try and address this refinery problem that we have, not only in transport, but in a whole range of different sectors.
While Majid is preparing, I'll give him a few minutes. I'm the fill-in person, so yeah. Well, I can talk not necessarily about that, but my experience of actually having a trainee come in and work in my area when I was with Transport for New South Wales. So we have an Aboriginal employment program, and we brought someone in. Now, this particular young fellow came from us. He joined us a year out of school, and for the 12 months before he came to join us, he was a labourer for a roofing company. So he spent all summer carrying tiles on his shoulder up very dodgy ramps and laying them on the roof without safety systems, a whole scary sort of thing. He came into our area through that special program, and within 18 months he had a Certificate 4 in IT. He had put together an incredible application that provided virtual reality for people to look around our research vehicle, and in fact we used that at the World Congress here in 2016. So from a fellow who was in a situation laying tiles in the middle of summer on a roof to someone with a Certificate 4 who is now actively contributing and a really valued member of our team, I think speaks so much towards that view that we need to have both our graduate programs, but we can also have other programs that are taking people directly as school leavers as well. And I think that balancing that and the different skill sets that we have is going to be really important for the future.
Yeah, just adding to adding to what John mentioned, and also addressing your sort of question, Amanda. I think the data and having sort of the students coming to university and getting interested in a particular sort of area and going forward is a very, very important sort of issue for also universities. For example, when it comes to a type of data, for example, transport data is significantly different from biomedical data, and having enough of a variety of, for example, transport or biomedical data for a student to get really skilled is a challenge also for university. However, we're trying to look at all those foundation that is needed for somebody to become a data scientist and provide that in the university. But definitely, the government and the industry playing a significant role. I know the Victorian government is very sort of open about the data. They provided data to public and has been significant in terms of allowing us to do what we need to do. And we would like to ask you to please keep doing that, and don't be worried about if somebody tried to embarrass the government, unfortunately, for some of the data that was in the public hand, and somebody tried to identify, this was, for example, this minister or that parliamentarian sending a message. So of course those kind of issues may happen, but we would like to ask you to please don't be discouraged by that, and keep providing the students and the society basically the oil that need to create that refinery. So that oil stops, you cannot create a refinery.
You've done it now.
I have, yeah.
Peter, can I just add to the point that Majid's making, that I think in government at the moment, one of the risks is that in Victoria at least there's strong concentration on infrastructure, and government's doing a great job on providing internships and graduate programs and the like for infrastructure construction.
Can everyone hear Gary at the back? Can you hear?
Can you hear me? Hopefully I have one of those voices.
Do we have
government at the moment, I think there's a challenge for governments to think about in these areas we're working on and talking about today, that they're not quite getting the funding that's needed, and consequently we're not seeing the internships that universities trying to get or graduate programs in those areas where these data analytics skills could really help. And I think that is a challenge for us to try and address with governments, certainly in Victoria anyway.
So in Michigan, we're really looking at that as well. So I work in the cyber aspect, and it's a lot of the same things. How do we upskill people? How do we upskill people immediately? We don't have time to wait 12 more years or 8 more years for people to get through that system. So our universities are starting to look at certificate programs that are augmenting their 4 years. So Wayne State, for example, is doing a certificate graduate program for people for cyber physical systems, which is very different from the network side. So we're not looking at just apprenticeships out of universities, but apprenticeships out of high school. How do we get students that are maybe not interested in going on that 4-year track to get an apprenticeship right out of high school and those certifications right out of high school to get them into the industry right away? Because there's different paths for every person, and we're trying to pull back. We recognized we were pushing all those 4-year degrees, which are wonderful, but we have an immediate need for workforce. And it's the same thing, whether it's cyber or data or IT. It's all, if you have the framework in place, you can plug and play. You can plug and play AI certifications. So it's really just changing that narrative and having those jobs at the end. So that's what we're trying to do as well, and look at our trades and really implement those things as well. But the universities are going to be that place for that lifelong learning. We recognize that in this new era, we're looking at, you're not going to go 4 years and then go into industry and do 30 years and be done. You're going to go to school for 4 years, you may get into industry, and then you may need to reskill that labor force, and they'll have that vessel to do so.
Great message, thank you, Sarah. Now we had two more. We had Nu and then a gentleman over here.
Okay, good. So I have to ask, obviously I'm not from Australia, but I have to ask, for us as system integrators,
we need a bit more volume on.
I can speak up, that's not a problem. So for us as system integrators, obviously the existence of something that we have in the United States, I call it the National ITS Architecture, and a whole bunch of communications interface standards. And I'm not talking about the connected vehicle standards because they're worldwide defined. But in order to integrate systems, which I think is a very, very important thing, what is actually being undertaken right here in Australia? I'm just kind of curious about that.
I can talk to that, I think. Yeah, so we do have a project at the moment through Austroads, through our network program, to build a national ITS architecture, and we were working very closely actually with Kenneth Vaughan in the US to build that in a harmonised fashion in terms of harmonising with the other ITS architectures that are occurring both in the US and Europe. To be honest, it hasn't got a lot of traction at the moment because I think in terms of agencies, they've developed their own road-based ITS architecture for their own jurisdiction, and that's fine, and it works very well in a world where your ITS is physically located on the road network and you don't have to actually interact or be compatible with other jurisdictions. But once it goes to something that's moving and talking to infrastructure in one jurisdiction, infrastructure in another, and we expect that seamless integration, that's when I think we'll probably get more traction in it. But we are definitely working on an Australian national ITS architecture.
We've got time for two more quick questions. This gentleman over here.
Mark Stevenson, University of Melbourne. Just interested to find out if government or industry are looking at this sort of optimum governance models for the transformation we're seeing in the transport system. Comments on that? It wasn't in Rollin's comment or yours, John.
Thanks, John. Thanks very much for that question. I think best way to answer that is to go to what state, territory and Commonwealth transport and infrastructure ministers are doing under the auspices of the Council of Australian Government Transport and Infrastructure Council. That just rolls off the tongue beautifully, I know. So that policy framework, which I touched on in my presentation, really is the if you like the organising framework that exists at the moment for governments across all levels to prepare for the deployment of transport technologies, including connected automated vehicles. So there's quite a substantial work program around that. So that provides a governance framework at a government level, and goes to a range of pieces of work, of which a very heavy focus is on adjusting legislative and regulatory frameworks to allow connected and automated vehicles to operate safely and legally on our roads. So that goes to the supply of the vehicle to the market, in-service arrangements, decommissioning. It goes to driving laws. It goes to things like insurance and ultimately looking at issues around responsibility in the event of an accident, how all that would work. So a substantial piece of work progressing through the National Transport Commission, and as I mentioned, Marcus Burke can talk a little bit more about that. So that's really the framework or the governance glue that I would point to as being the most substantial governance framework that currently exists in Australia at the government level. Of course, industry is doing things. That governance framework does, government governance framework does include bodies like Austroads as well, in terms of getting technical expertise and the like. So that's how that hangs together.
Thanks, Rollin. And Mark, I apologise, I couldn't recognise you from here. So, good to see you. So the last question is going to be from Brian Negus, and then we're going to take a break, and Majid's going to take over.
Thanks very much, Peter. Brian Negus from the Seeker Group and also from ITS Australia. In the last couple of days and previously in our discussions on mass or connected and automated vehicles, collaboration has been mentioned very frequently. My question goes to what are we doing to take the community along with us? In all of these areas, we get it in this room. We're sort of preaching to the converted. I've had the same discussion about road user charging, for example. We're preaching to the converted. We all get the rationale for it. But what are we doing to take the community with us? I'm interested in our colleagues from Michigan, but also from the Australian context. What are the plans to actually make sure the community understands what we're trying to achieve and what are the benefits to the community?
Thanks, Brian. Susan, do you want to start with that?
Yeah, I'll start with that. We're actually doing a number of pilots where we put the consumer and the end user first in the conversation, one of which is called Project Kinetic, which I'm going to talk about a little bit later. There's a fact sheet about it. But we're putting the end-use consumer at the very beginning of those conversations and asking them what their transportation issue challenges are in the city of Detroit. And then taking the technologies and trying to prove them out from a feasibility standpoint and a sustainability standpoint to inject those into the transportation system to really address real challenges of the people of the city of Detroit. It's a very interesting population that we have there, and so I think it's key to always keep that end user in mind as you're developing these solutions. Like Kirk says, we are the choir, right? Don't need to sell us, but you have to sell people at the end of the day that are going to be using these technologies, and they got to see it in their communities.
Thanks, Susan. Final comment from Roland, I think, and then we probably need to take a break. Yes?
Thanks, Peter. Look, I think, Brian, that's a really good question. I'd say that there are things happening, but I think more needs to be done in that space. The sorts of things that are happening, a lot is happening at the state and the territory level in terms of various trials around the place. The AIMS test bed at the University of Melbourne is another example. So people can see, experience the technology in a number of localities. And John, I think last count, there were probably 20 or 30 testing demonstration trials that governments were involved with around the country, and I think Australia actually has on its website a list of those trials. There are, of course, things that the private sector is doing as well. Transurban has done work on the orbital networks around cities. So there are some of those sorts of trials, but my sense is, and Susan, may have some views as well, more needs to be done, I think, in getting broader community engagement and understanding around what this actually might mean for people in different circumstances.
Thank you, Rollin. I think I think that's well covered. So please, so you've met the Max team. Here they are. This is it. You've heard a little bit. I'm not going to try and summarise this discussion because we're going to be just talking all day. So let's move on. Please join me in thanking the Max team.